Hey US History, today we are going to finish up chapter 21, all about the 30s. Alright, so we are going to do two sections, but again, kind of like we've been doing when we kind of speed through chapters, it's because there's a lot of detail in there that you don't necessarily need to know. So when you're doing your notes, please make them sparser, make them, just hit the super important trends and patterns, okay? I'm not looking for 20 pages. Please don't give me long notes. Please don't take so much of your time like that. Just give notes that hit the important parts, kind of like we do in these lessons, okay? So, FDR and the New Deal. So where we left off, FDR had just beaten Herbert Hoover in the 1932 presidential election. So, banking crisis. Now there's an emotional backdrop to the inauguration of the new president. And he starts off with the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Trying to help everybody calm down a little bit. So really, more than anything, he's fighting fear. Immediately after assuming office, he wants to start up again. So he does two things. One, he calls a special meeting of Congress, a special session, and then he declares a bank holiday. The banking crisis has brought the financial markets to a standstill. 38 states had closed almost all their banks. And so the banking holiday, Roosevelt issued an executive order forbidding the export of gold. So he pushes through the Emergency Banking Act, forcing all Americans to turn in their gold in exchange for paper money. He took America off the gold standard and made the dollar worth less and allowed Roosevelt to pursue these inflationary programs. The first 100 days of a president's office are usually when he can get the most done because it's when his approval ratings are highest. So Congress convenes on March 9th and remains in emergency session until June 16th for 100 days. In those crucial 100 days, Congress passes Roosevelt's New Deal programs one after another, and we like to call them alphabet soup, or alphabet agencies. And you'll see why in a minute. They're pretty much all 3 words long, and they're all acronyms. So rarely has a president enjoyed such cooperation. The nation watched in approval of this quick action because they're like, good, he's getting things done. Besides his cabinet members, which, fun fact, included the first female Secretary of Labor, Roosevelt recruited a group of advisors. This group was called the Brain Trust, mostly of professors, and he took people who knew what they were doing and had them come advise him. On the first day of the emergency session, Congress approved the Emergency Banking Act. Then they established the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided $4 billion in federal relief. They created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to deal with farm problems. They legalized beer and then repealed prohibition. And he attempted to provide some regulation for the nation's industries and approved the Tennessee Valley Authority. So far, we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. We have the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority. We have the Emergency Banking Act. See what I mean about alphabet soup? Oh, it gets worse. And then to keep the nation informed and to keep them from getting too depressed, he holds these radio fireside chats, is what he calls them. They're these informal radio messages, and about half of American families own radios, and many who didn't went to other people's houses. His charm, his fatherly manner carried him over the airwaves and really helped with his approval ratings. So what else? What other alphabet agencies? Oh, we got the NRA. So the EVA isn't really an alphabet agency, but it is another acronym. So the CCC, the AAA, the NRA, the TVA, other alphabet agencies. Former Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith said, "It looks as if some absent-minded professors played anagrams with alphabet soup." The goal was the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So relief, fix things. Recovery, heal, and reform, make it so it doesn't happen again. The major role that the New Deal played in broadening the activities and the authority does warrant a brief survey of some of the important ones. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, young unmarried men to work in reforestation and soil conservation under the supervision of the Army, is very popular and lasted for a long time. Then you have the Public Works Administration, PWA, which during its 6 years of existence built school buildings, courthouses, hospitals, bridges, and other public facilities. Also a work relief thing. So again, helping people by giving them jobs. It also supported teachers, artists, writers, public enrichment activities. That was the Civil Works Administration, the CWA. Specifically supported teachers, artists, writers. Then the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, carried some of this onward. All of these programs combined, however, were unable to provide enough jobs to eliminate the dole, which is just giving money. Therefore, one other major program, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, also provided work relief in an attempt to eliminate these doles. It built and repaired roads, constructed public buildings. Many people considered it make work, so unnecessary jobs. But none of this, and all of this cost the government billions of dollars, but none of it was enough to actually eradicate the huge job crisis that's happening. Okay? So, other New Deals. Two major measures to attack the widespread problems in the agricultural industry. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, and its supplements established a new method of subsidizing farm products, aiding debt-ridden farms, basically stopping them from being foreclosed. Then we have another couple important ones. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempted to organize guidelines for industries to help increase employment. The big one was the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration. It set out 540 specific codes, all of which tended to raise prices and wages, reduce hours, and remove competition and opportunity for innovation. It included some unusual code provisions, like lumber companies had to keep lists of customers' names, investment security analysts were fined for sending letters to prospective clients without permission, dry cleaners who operated in low-traffic areas could not charge lower prices. Jewelers could not advertise watch repair prices. This was an attempt at industrial planning and industrial control, and it was ultimately unsuccessful. And actually, the NIRA and the AAA were both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The government exercising too much power. There are a couple other programs, though, that were intended to provide security and benefits. So you have a banking act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. You do not have to memorize all of these, good grief. You should just know trends. So the FDIC was an agency that was devised to ensure bank deposits, to ensure the bank deposits so that if the banks declared bankruptcy, Americans wouldn't lose their money. Then the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, instituted these pensions and unemployment insurance, Social Security, things like that. And that was meant to help. They also before Social Security, there's a lot of these all in one spot. The TVA undertook a project to build dams along the Tennessee River that would provide navigation, flood control, and cheap electricity. Then the Social Security Act provided Social Security, which is basically you pay taxes as you're growing up, and then when you're older, you get all those back when you can't work anymore. That's the concept of Social Security. Then, of course, today that's hard because Social Security is having to pay more money than people are going into it. So a lot of people think that by the time you and I get old enough to retire, there will be nothing left in Social Security. Then there's another one, Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, which offered funds to farmer cooperatives in exchange for extending electricity. That's a lot. It's a lot of government stuff. So what's happening? Roosevelt's extensive New Deal activities sought to meet the nation's demands for change. He's taking action, and so he's being praised a lot. But he does get a lot of criticism and opposition, particularly from the Republicans. People to the political right, so most Republicans and some Democrats, found a lot in the New Deal to criticize. One, it's expensive. The New Deal costs a lot of money. Two, you're increasing government regulation of things. So you're increasing government power, government regulation. Finally, the New Deal's not actually working that well. America's not out of debt. People are still jobless. People are still losing things. And it's not, millions of people are still unemployed. It's not actually really fixing anything. The opponents found cause for rejoicing in 1935 when the Supreme Court found some of the New Deal legislation to be against the Constitution. And so but after 2 years of compliance, it began to question things. On May 27, 1935, the court declared unanimously that the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, was unconstitutional. And then the NRA follows. Because remember, that was trying to establish a lot of control over things. Early in 1936, the Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act as well. So clearly, it's kind of losing momentum. Then there's opposition from the left. You have Huey Long, who's a loud-mouthed, plain-spoken former governor of Louisiana, and he wanted to share our wealth. He thought that the government should tax the rich and redistribute to the poor. The idea was alarming and impractical, but became popular among some of the poor who thought that they would just get handouts. Long seemed to be stealing some support from Roosevelt ahead of the election that was coming up in 1936, and he was known as the Kingfish, but then he was assassinated in September of 1935 before he could run for president. Another popular plan was one proposed by Francis Townsend. He proposed that the government pay a pension of $200 a month to each citizen over 60, provided that they agreed to hold no job and spend every penny they received. Because if they're spending money, then it's going back into the economy. They're providing jobs. If you go buy a watch, then that watchmaker has a job, right? The pension will be financed by a 2% national sales tax, and thousands joined this. But ultimately, it did not pass either. Another challenger was Father Charles Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest. And by 1934, the eloquent priest was telling his audience over the radio that they needed to abandon gold and replace capitalism with this concept of social justice. Although radical opposition to the New Deal was ultimately unsuccessful, it's very interesting because now you have socialism, you have New Deal, and you have people that don't want any government intervention at all, and everybody's fighting over it. So then there's a switch in time. Roosevelt believed that his overwhelming election victory had given him a clear mandate to proceed. The Supreme Court stopping him was not in the plan necessarily. And in 1937, he announced a plan to enlarge the Supreme Court. He wanted to appoint new justices to make it more efficient. There were 9. He wanted to add potentially up to 6 more to make it 15. The president's proposal, of course, generates a storm of opposition. If he put 6 new judges in there, all who agreed with him, then he'd be able to win most of the Supreme Court issues. So this was a court-packing plan. And because of the extensive opposition, court reform failed to win approval, even in the Democrat-controlled Congress. But eventually, one of the justices decided to retire. And then another justice left and voted with a new majority. And so there were a couple that switched. And then Roosevelt even eventually was able to nominate several members of the Supreme Court. By 1940, he had actually nominated 5 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court. So even though he didn't get to add in justices, eventually, because they were retiring, because they were old, he was able to have a lot of justices in the Supreme Court on his side. Despite the criticism, though, his popularity remains widespread. In the election in 1936, the Republicans really only have one viable candidate, and his name is Alf Landon. As one of only 7 Republican governors at the time, and the only one to have won re-election, he was really the only Republican who was in any way popular. Although Landon had a progressive record and supported much of the New Deal, Republicans hoped that he would return business prosperity, kind of like Calvin Coolidge did. He maintained some hopes of winning, but ultimately speaking, Roosevelt just had so much popularity. Now, re-election is hard for Roosevelt too, because the nation is still in a severe economic depression. Despite all of his New Deal alphabet soup programs, there's still not jobs for everybody, and things still aren't looking up. And it's just so there's a lot that's happening. But you do have a couple measures being passed during this time that give new hope to workers, such as the Congress of Industrial Organization, trying to help laborers find new jobs. Okay? And so with all this, because there still is hope, because FDR still does have pretty big approval ratings, in the 1936 election, the Republicans actually lose by a lot. He won by a landslide. The Republicans only won 2 states. So in electoral votes, it was 523 to 8. So Roosevelt won a huge victory and then said, cool, well, in that case, I'm going to keep going because I just won. And so what's happening now? What's happening in the 1930s generally? So now we've gone over some alphabet soup, we've gone over some programs, stuff like that. But what is it like for normal people? So let's talk about the family. So the family is hard because 95 cases of starvation were reported in New York City during 1931. But then the report's probably inflated, but starvation is occurring. These people are dying because there's no food to eat. And so you've got these bread lines that are forming along the city that for soup kitchens just to go get food. relief payment to help support a family of 5 could be $5.25 per week. And that would be all you would get as a family to try and live off of. That's all that they could give you. You also have homelessness. About 2 million people were uprooted from their homes in the 1930s. A few of them deliberately fled the torment of watching their families suffer, but many were young unmarried men, teenage boys. They'd given up hope of finding a job, and they just became homeless. Countless thousands of families faced the threat of homelessness too. A lot of them rented houses and apartments now, and they couldn't pay. Rent in those days was typically low. It might be $10 a month, but even that was beyond the means of a family on relief if you're trying to eat as well. Then race. As with almost everything in American history, people of color had it much worse than white Americans did. In 1932, about half of all African American workers were unemployed, which is insanely high. And then many are moving because they hope to find a job elsewhere, and the North is no longer looking like a good place to find a job. Government relief efforts are slow to reach the Black Americans as well. A lot of the government control was harmful to them. However, Roosevelt was able to win a lot of Democratic support from people of color. And so before Roosevelt, people of color mostly voted exclusively for Republicans. But after Roosevelt, through his term, you have this switch where people of color are usually voting for Democrats now. By the polls. Obviously, the color of your skin does not determine who you vote for. But by the polls, a majority of black voters were now voting Democrat, whereas before they voted Republican. Now, there were a couple good things happening during the 1930s. It wasn't like everybody was just miserable all day, every day, although there were certainly a lot of hardships. But some of the good things was you've got radios. You have 80 million Americans that didn't experience homelessness or starvation. And that was over half, which again doesn't make things okay, but it means that not everybody in America was miserable all the time. And so some of them, the ones who did have it harder, still wanted to find ways to escape, right? And so you have books, and then are starting to become movies. There was a movie produced in 1939, Gone with the Wind, that became very famous. Feature films of fantasy and drama. Walt Disney's first animated presentation, Snow White, was released in 1938, in the middle of the Great Depression. Radio became the most popular medium, though. You've got radio shows and songs, and Orson Welles doing H.G. Wells' War of the World on major networks being read to every week. And then there were other diversions, some of the real-life dramas. The 1932 kidnapping of the son of aviation hero Charles Lindbergh. All across the nation, people were eager to hear of any developments in the case. And eventually, the search, it was awful because the child was actually found dead, and the search for the murderer required more than 2 years of detective work and ended up in the conviction and execution of a German immigrant named Bruno Hauptmann. Other crimes that gained wide attention during the Depression were usually like bank robbing. Although these desperate criminals were sometimes lauded as modern-day Robin Hoods, they weren't necessarily treated that way. In fact, there was even public enemy number one, John Dillinger. He was joined by other people such as Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, Bonnie and Clyde. Like, these criminals, this is when they're alive, this is when they're committing crimes. It's the 30s. Most of these criminals died in a hail of gunfire, spent long stints in jail. Lawmen, especially the FBI, led by Director J. Edgar Hoover, became heroes as they cracked down criminals. Then you have an FBI agent, Melvin Purvis, who led the team that cornered and killed Dillinger, who was public enemy number one. Yeah. Then you have other things happening. Amelia Earhart becomes America's flying heroine. She became the first woman to cross the Atlantic. But in 1937, when she wanted to be the first woman to fly all around the world, obviously stopping to refuel and stuff, she disappeared over the Pacific, and no one actually knows what happened. But then you had other tragedies too. The humorist Will Rogers perished in an airplane crash in Alaska. Then you had the 1930s explosion and crash of the Zeppelin Hindenburg, which was, I think, like a giant blimp that quite literally exploded and crashed on fire in midair. It was absolutely terrifying and awful. There's a picture in your book on page 479. We're almost done, by the way. So then, then you also have sports going on. Let's see, world fairs, the Chicago World Fair, particularly Century of Progress Innovations, New York World's Fair, exhibits and technological innovations. So there's still things happening. There's still culture. The culture of the 30s was very rich and very definitive, but it was also defined by the Depression. But a new decade is dawning, and war is starting over in Europe again. World War II is coming in. We learned about that last year in world history, all the different causes of World War II. Obviously, you have Hitler, but think about why Hitler was even able to come to power in Germany in the first place. And so we now have this new decade. And despite America being in such an economic depression, there is a little bit of hope dawning, hope for peace and prosperity, which, well, the 40s, maybe not so much. But anyways, we'll get started with the 40s next week. I leave you with this. We are going to do World War II before we have our test on that. So keep going. Remember, today your homework political cartoon Judo Pod is due. And with that said, I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day. Bye.